welcome everybody tonight to the 31st Historic Calgary Week. My name is Kathleen Rogers, and I would like to thank you for signing into our talk tonight, Invasion of the Infills. I have the pleasure of welcoming tonight's speaker. Richard White, also known as the Everyday Tourist, is a Calgary-based urban analyst, columnist, blogger, focusing on urban development, urban design, and urban travel.
Thank you, Kathleen. The inspiration for today's talk has been some Twitter chatter that's happened over probably the last year, but I think certainly intensified during COVID when many people were walking in their communities and other communities. And there were certainly lots of comments made by people on Twitter like this one here, where people really seem to almost resent the fact that there were these big 2.5, 3-story, some people call them monster infills beside the cute, early 20th century cottage homes. And as an urbanist, as somebody who loves cities, I love the heritage homes, but I also appreciate what the infills bring to a community as somebody who lives in one. Another slide that was on Twitter was this one that showed that Calgary only had 47% of its pre-1945 homes remaining in 2016 versus 1961. And that was significantly less than places like Winnipeg, Saskatoon, Toronto, Regina. Obviously, Calgary, Edmonton, and Vancouver were worse than Calgary. And, it's almost directly, you could almost say that the number of infills happening in a city directly relates to how many heritage homes get torn down and replaced by an infill. And while that's sad for some, it's actually good for others. One of the issues that people have is, as I've already talked a little bit about, the design compatibility. The smaller homes, they've got a lot more character to them. The new homes tend to be very bland. They're very beige or gray. They're stucco. They're not brick. They're not wood. They're vinyl siding. They flat roof. They just don't seem to fit in. Here's another example. This is a duplex, against a little house that is still in existence. Actually, this is probably only a few blocks from my house. What is a heritage home? People often ask me, and the easiest way to, I think, describe it is that it's a house built prior to 1945. It must have some unique design, materials, something unique about its architecture. Ideally, maybe somebody important lived there or something important happened there. There are other factors, but these are probably the main ones. I do want to acknowledge that I have a bias. I live in an early 90s infill on a former 100-foot lot. When in the late 80s, there was only one home here with one person living. Now there are 3 homes on this 100-foot lot. There are now 4 children and 6 adults. And one of the things that people sometimes, I think, forget about in the infill discussion, it's not only about the density that the infills bring to a community, but it's the diversity. And certainly, in the 30 years that I've lived in Calgary, infills have become more diverse. Not only are they just skinnies, but they are larger homes. They are corner conversions, they're townhouses, they're triplexes, they're duplexes. And I think all of that diversity attracts a different person, a different lifestyle to your community. So I'm going to play a little bit of the devil's advocate tonight, and I'll talk a little bit about preservation versus revitalization. I do want to acknowledge that I love heritage homes, and I think they're important to our community, but I also love infill homes, and I think they are just as important and maybe even more important than heritage homes. So one of the things that I've done, over the last year, especially with COVID, and I think a lot of us have done that, is to wander Calgary and get to know Calgary, not only my community, West Hillhurst, but all of the surrounding neighborhoods. And one of the things that I found, one of the things I really tried to pay attention to, was how many older heritage homes there still were, especially in the inner city, where we've seen thousands of infills built every year. And so I was pleased to find that, whether it's Bankview, I found dozens of nice heritage homes, all in different states of repair. This lovely little home was just a lovely hidden gem. Sunelta has some beautiful homes like this painted lady with this lovely porch. West Hillhurst has this heritage charmer, these sort of wartime houses, and the number of them are actually getting fixed. I love the driveway here. I've often thought that one of the things the suburbs could do if they wanted to kind of improve their streetscape was have a driveway like this, where there's a strip of grass and it's not just a flat concrete pad. And you see that in older homes. So there's probably some lessons to be learned from these heritage homes in urban design. The Beltline was a big surprise. When I wanted the Beltline, it's amazing, given all the high rises that are there and all the office buildings, you would think there'd be no heritage homes left. And yet there are still many heritage homes, little homes, two-story homes, mansions that still exist even after 50, 60 years of infill development. Of course, Inglewood has many painted ladies. Rosedale is a lovely place. If you haven't gone to walk and you're interested in heritage homes, Rosedale is like a walk back in time, and it has a lovely mix of smaller houses like this and obviously much larger homes. Mount Royal again is, was part of the city beautiful, the whole park light setting. There are bigger lots. They have, garden-like, park-like front yards. And I think, again, it helps us to appreciate that a great city has hundreds of different types of communities that appeal to thousands of different types of people. Inglewood, of course, our oldest community. And I've taken some pictures here of some larger houses. I think sometimes when people think of heritage homes, they often think of the small cottage working class house. But many of the older heritage homes were also mansions. They were also monsters in their day. Compared to the little 600 square foot house that was next door to them. And, one of the other comments that people make about infills is, the cookie cutter, and they look the same. But, really, housing in Calgary, housing in North America has been cookie cutter for over 100 years. When you look at whether it's in Sunnyside or Hillhurst, many of the houses are all the same. In fact, many were purchased by a catalog. And you can see the same house not only in Calgary, but in Edmonton, Regina, Saskatoon. One of the things that I love on Twitter is when people post things like this. And this was a lovely posting that gives you a little walking tour, gives you a little bit of information of where you can go in Mount Pleasant and see some lovely heritage homes. And I think that is a great thing for Calgarians to do so that people can appreciate and people can see that there is more history in Calgary than many Calgarians and many outsiders appreciate. So one of the things that I have noticed in my visits to cities around North America in particular is that Calgary probably is the infill capital of North America. Every year for, probably the last 10, 15 years, thousands of new infill single family homes have been built. Most in the inner city communities, most closer to downtown. One of the things that, is very interesting to me is that even today, as downtown is in a decline as an employment center, there's still a very strong demand. I have not seen any downturn in the infill development of the communities that I visited. And I think one of the things that these infills do is that they help revitalize these older neighborhoods. And as they get revitalized, they become more attractive. It's kind of a cascade effect. You build more new homes, new families come in, new amenities, and it really is something that takes on its own life. And even though downtown is a bit in trouble right now, it's not the employment center it was, it's maybe not the cultural center it once was. Still living near the river, living near places like the library, the National Music Center, the Glenbow, are all very attractive for Calgarians. So what is an infill? An infill is a new home or homes on a lot that once had an older home. So it could be a McMansion or a monster home, so a single family, although even that is somewhat suspect because often we'll call it a single family home, but sometimes those homes are actually multifamily, multi-generational homes. So, you know, when somebody says, okay, we take out a single house and build another single house, there's no more density added. Well, there might be no more density as far as the housing, but there might be more density in the population, in that the old house might have had one senior living in it. The new house might have 4 people living in it, may have grandparents living in it. And so I think, you know, people, you know, not every monster house or McMansion is just for 2 people. And then of course there's duplexes, or as I think they like to call them now, twins, because duplex, the older term, had a little bit more of a negative connotation. There's what I call corner conversions, where they take out a single house on the corner and put in 3 or 4 townhouses. And then there's low-rise multifamily houses, which are, you know, anywhere from, you know, 4 to probably 12 stories. And they kind of fit often on larger lots. They often fit where there's lots of amenities, and they fit maybe on transit routes where people can take advantage of that. So, you know, what you see here, you know, is the bungalow versus the 2-story. And, you know, as soon as you add a second story, the house becomes larger. And of course, that tends to be, you know, the new reality that, as I like to say, 2 incomes pays for 2-story house, 2-car garage, 2 cars, 2 vacations every year, all of those kinds of things. People just don't live in the same way that they used to in 1945. Children, you know, families have 2 children, they don't have 4 and 6 children. Children have their own bedroom, children have their own bathroom. Heaven forbid mom and dad have to share a bathroom with their children. You know, the media rooms, there's office spaces. That's how the average family in Calgary lives these days. You know, here's some Briar Hill mansions. You could call them monster homes. You know, they play a role, I think, in making Briar Hill an attractive place to live. Briar Hill is close to the LRT, it's close to a library, close to university, close to SAIT. It's a very attractive community, and I think the mansion homes are part of the diversity of that community. Infills come in all shapes and sizes. And I found this particular street interesting because here are 3 infills. Sometimes the infills tend to all look the same on the same street. Often it's the same developer and he'll be using the same architect. And in some cases, you know, it's different. And again, the aesthetics here, some people like it when all the houses have a similar, you know, it's like in the suburbs when you have architectural controls. So things kind of look like they fit together. And then other people like this more diverse design that's a little bit more hodgepodge, a little bit more varied. And again, what one person likes, another person doesn't. These homes probably look very stark because there's no trees. Many of the pictures that I show of the heritage homes still have their front yard trees, and the trees are taller than the houses. And I often say, you know, don't judge a street or a community until the trees have grown taller than the houses, because they then to soften, you know, the streetscape and make it much more attractive. This is actually on my street, so you can see the difference between 2 skinnies built in the 80s and then a duplex that's built in the 10s. And I would say, you know, certainly the 2 new infills are not my style, not particularly, but that whole cubist, that whole rectangular look has become very popular in the last 10 years. And I can't help but think that in 50 years, 100 years, these may become very quaint and very funky for people looking back at what was happening in the early 21st century. You know, this is a typical duplex that you'll find side by side. And again, it's driven by the need for people to have more space. Instead of having 8 feet or 4 feet on either side and a little space that doesn't get used between the houses, all of a sudden you get 4 feet times 50 feet. You get 200 square feet more on each level. And that adds an extra bathroom, maybe a library, you know, all of those things that make it more attractive. And if we want more people to live in the inner city, the housing has to compete with what's available in the suburbs, and especially on scale. And so this is where you see, I think, these kinds of houses become very attractive to young families. And they're also, I think, very attractive to empty nesters who maybe want to move out of the suburbs, move into the inner city where, you know, they have access to the river and they have access to cultural activities, more walkable communities. But they don't really want, you know, they don't really want to move into a condo, and they don't really want to move into an 800 square foot bungalow. Here's a Briar Hill Modern. So again, just all the different shapes and sizes that I think make the streetscapes in the inner city very interesting, because they're no longer cookie cutter cottage homes, but they're you know, duplexes and triplexes and townhomes and mansions of, you know, traditional and modern. You know, here's a you know, this particular house is actually 3 houses. So there's actually a house on the front side, and then there's 2 on the back side, and they have entrances on the side. And so developers have gotten very creative in how to add density. Some people call it invisible density, because if you went by this house quickly, you'd probably think it's just a mansion, a monster house, when in fact it's 3 houses. And I think we shouldn't forget that, you know, Calgarians have been building mansions, you know, in the inner city communities for over a century. This particular house is on 13th Avenue, and 13th Avenue was lined with mansions. Many of them are now gone, which is unfortunate. But there are still many that are, or not many, but there's still a few still there, including the Lougheed House, which I think, you know, is important, that if a house has significant architecture, if it has a significant history, then it's definitely worth preserving. And here again is in Inglewood, where you can see that there's you know, older houses that were, you know, quite large, and you know, dominated that community at that time. And if you go to Mount Royal, you know, again, you'll see many old heritage mansions, but then you'll see new mansions like this. And I think it adds to the aesthetics. It adds to bringing young people into an older community, and that creates diversity. I think I remember one time I went to a garage sale, and I was surprised at how many of the garage sales in Mount Royal actually had children's stuff. I always thought that, you know, it was for older people who had made a lot of money, and kids had all grown up. But in fact, you know, there was like a parade of garage sales, and there were lots of children. Similarly, when you get to Chinook Park, which again, you don't really think of as inner city, you don't really think of it as an infill, but again, I mean, this is a community that was built in the 60s, and already those homes are becoming antiquated based on current demands of the family. And you're getting these, I think, very funky and fun houses that, you know, add another dimension to the aesthetics of the community. Now, some people may disagree with me. You know, beauty, aesthetics is in the eye of the beholder. You know, Calgary still has one of the things that I noticed and made a note of when I was walking this past year. They have some lovely streets that still have older homes that are preserved. This one in Sinelta is a great example. If you go to Cliff Bungalow, despite all of the development that's been happening in the Mission Cliff Bungalow area, there's still lots of heritage homes, and there's some integrity where there's, you know, here 5, 6, 7 homes together that, you know, do give you a sense of what the community was like 50, 100 years ago. This is in Sunnyside, and I would certainly love to see this street somehow managed so that it was preserved, these cottage homes with their small front yards, as an example of how Calgarians used to live. And I think it would be great if there was some way that this could be maintained in perpetuity. You know, Inglewood, of course, there's still lots of streets, despite all that's happening in Inglewood. You can find streets like this with all kinds of heritage homes. And I think it's quite amazing to me that, given Calgary's a young city, and given that Calgary is perceived as a city that doesn't value its heritage, doesn't value older buildings, I would say to the contrary. I would say that Calgary has a lot of older buildings, and that many of them are still very well preserved. They're still lived in. They're not boarded up like some cities. and they're not slums. They're not, they are viable homes for individuals who want to live that lifestyle. And then, there's streets that have nothing left of the, what happened 50 years ago. And you got a street like this in Capitol Hill. But again, I can't help but wonder if this isn't an example of the history of the 21st century, and that people 100 years from now will be looking and saying, this is how people lived. They lived in 2 stories. They had homes with front yards and backyards. Who knows what people will live in 100 years from now? These may become these potentially will become the heritage homes of the future. And this is a lovely little street. These houses are, 50s houses. And, it's one of the few streets in West Hillhurst where there was, this was taken before this summer, one of the houses, I think it's the 3rd one here, got knocked down. And there is now a 2-story infill. But there are still lots of these small bungalows that were built in the 50s. How important it is to keep the entire street, I don't know. That could be part of our discussion. If you get to Mission, again, an area that has seen huge infilling, lots of small low-rise condo apartment buildings. There's still lots of heritage homes. And this is just across from the Holy Cross Hospital. And there's a lovely little street of heritage homes that I think would be ideal to be preserved. And even when you get to Manchester, you don't think of Manchester as having any homes, and yet there's still a block of these heritage homes, cookie cutter homes. Obviously, they all look exactly the same. And as you can see, some of them have been converted into commercial uses, which is another way of preserving a heritage home, is if you can find commercial uses, and it really depends on its location. So in Marda Loop, the heritage conversions are into shops. So whether it's jewelry shops, hair salons, I think one's a tailor, they turn over quite regularly. But I think they definitely add to the charm of the community. You can see behind the infill that is a mid-rise, condo building. But with that comes, grocery stores, Phil and Sebastian cafes, yoga studios, drug stores, all the things that help make a community more walkable. And so you need that density and diversity in order to make a complete community. It can't be all heritage homes, and it can't all be, well, it could all be infill homes, but that wouldn't be desirable either. And of course, another thing that you're seeing is this kind of mix, where this is in Hillhurst, and you're seeing these, I think, quite attractive, where they have a little podium at the bottom with sort of townhouses, and then above it they have setback apartments, and they're mixed in. And I would say probably within the next 10 years you'll probably see the rest of these houses disappear. It's very desirable location right behind Riley Park. Not very far from a C train station, not very far from a grocery store. And again, if the city is going to densify, these are the places where you want to densify, around an LRT station, near a school. Queen Elizabeth School isn't very far away. The Hillhurst School, elementary school, is not very far away. Up the hill is Sate. I think we have to let these kinds of things, we have to let communities evolve. Nob Hill, I thought this was an interesting, within a few blocks, you can see what looks like a 1950s, maybe 1960s duplexes, and you got a whole row of them, cookie cutter. And then you see, what's happened in the last 10, 15 years, where very similar, but much more density. And I think more interesting, in color and interesting in shape of design. That allows the same space to be converted into, I don't know, maybe 10 times the amount of density, and certainly add more diversity to the community. So, in a bit of a summary, the benefits, the infill benefits, it diversifies the housing stock. It's more attractive to young families. It's also attractive, and I don't think people appreciate this, to empty nesters and seniors who don't want to live in an old house anymore, want something new, potentially want to rent. It increases the tax base for the city, helps curb urban sprawl, and it improves the amenities and services for all of the community. The problem with infills is the demolishing of older homes, destroys the character of the street. I would argue it maybe temporarily destroys the street ambiance, but over time it actually creates its own street ambiance. It becomes a different aesthetics, a different type of streetscape, but I think it can be just as attractive. It also removes affordable housing from the inner city. Many of these smaller homes are much more affordable because they're smaller. They're also homes where some seniors have lived. So there needs to be a replacement of that affordable housing. There needs to be, seniors housing, accessible housing, and I think that does come with the infill projects. I know of one great accessible project that happens in Rosemount, right near Confederation Park. I know that there's an affordable housing project on 14th Street. I think, people don't realize that not all the infills are just single family for upscale families, but many of them are for Calgarians of all ages and backgrounds. It does increase traffic. It does increase street parking. And in some cases, the loss of mature trees. In most cases, the city trees that are on the city property are maintained, and there is a penalty if in fact the developer kills the tree, but there often are trees that are on the private property that are lost. So I guess really the question is, when I go back and look at the Twitter chatter and people lamenting that, we're losing our heritage homes so quickly, how many older homes do we need? Is it 1 or 2 per block? Is it important that we find streets and clusters of heritage homes in each neighborhood and maintain those? Is there some sort of benchmark that we want to keep, so many homes from each decade, so many homes of each style? I haven't seen that, but that may exist. And I do feel after walking all of these communities, whether it's Inglewood, Ramsey, Hillhurst, Sunnyside, Beltline, Sunelta, Rosedale, Crescent Heights, Scarborough, Roxborough, West Hillhurst, Parkdale, Briar Hill, Bankview, Richmond, Nob Hill, Tuxedo Park, Mount Pleasant, Bridgeland, Riverside. I think there's like 26 different communities that I walked in that I would say have hundreds of heritage homes, at least 100. And again, I did find this map that has been done recently. It's called a windshield survey. So I believe somebody just drove around and looked at homes and identified homes that looked like they were older. And you can see that there is a significant number of heritage homes scattered throughout the inner city in the communities that were populated before 1945. You can see here, even in the Beltline, there's a significant number of heritage homes or heritage assets. They're not all heritage homes. So, I do feel that Calgary and Calgarians sometimes we're too hard on ourselves about our history, that we have preserved a lot of our history and we still have a lot of our history. And as I like to say, we're still making our history. So I guess, when it comes to the preservation side of the preservation versus prosperity equation, whose responsibility is it? Is it the city? Is it the homeowners? Is it a foundation? Do we just let the market decide? If I had one wish from a heritage perspective, I would love to see a foundation set up, a heritage foundation. When I was visiting in 2019 Vancouver, I discovered Mole Hill, which is a whole block of Queen Anne and Victoria homes that have been purchased over time by a foundation, the Mole Hill Foundation, and they've been all renovated, fixed up, they're rented, and some of them are affordable housing, some of them rented to artists, some are rented to single moms, and it's a very vibrant community. The back lane has community gardens, there's a park, there's a creek. It's just a lovely oasis in the middle of the city. And there's a park across the street. I think it's Nelson Park across the street. So it's again, a great location. It's right in the downtown core. And, I think that would be a model that Calgary should look at. We already have the Parks Foundation to provide enhanced parks and enhanced maintenance of parks, why wouldn't we try and set up a heritage preservation foundation that would do the same thing? And you could buy those little homes in Sunnyside, and we could rent them out to artists or rent them out to writers or anybody, and they would be maintained in perpetuity. To me, it's the citizens, it's not the city that should be responsible for preservation, but that's just my opinion. Here's another example of Mole Hill. You can see the back side of these houses. They're definitely multi-family houses, and they have lovely color and character. So I did want to talk a little bit about my experience, because when you talk about an invasion, it sounds like that the infills are just taking over. And one of the things that I've lived in West Hillhurst for 25 years, West Hillhurst has been one of the most active infill communities in Calgary for that 25 years. It seems to me when I walk around my community that there is a new infill on almost every other block for the last 25 years. And so you'd think that there would be no more heritage homes left. But most blocks still have a few older homes, including my street that has a couple of wartime houses, and it has a lovely, little heritage home, cottage home, single, maybe 650 square feet with the turret. And like I say, and we've got monster infills there. Right beside us is, 3 stories. It's like a small condo. Lovely children live there. We interact with them. There's tiny bungalows. The street's got seniors, it's got young families, we've got students, we've got young professionals. And so, I look at it and I say, it's not an invasion, it's an evolution. It doesn't happen overnight. I'm also thinking that by the time I'm ready to leave my house, somebody is either going to knock it down or going to preserve it as an example of late 20th century Calgary housing. So the urban challenge that I think every city has is to adapt to the new economics, the new market, the new technologies that urban life presents. You can't continue to live in the past. I think great cities, yes, they have a past. Yes, they preserve some of that past, but they're much more about the prosperity and moving into the future. So yes, I think great cities include balancing the need for preservation for prosperity. The big issue is what's the balance? It's always too much for some and not enough for others. Thankfully, Calgary continues to have thousands of charming heritage homes in dozens of communities. In my opinion, there has been no infill invasion, rather a healthy upgrading of housing inventory to meet the diversity of demands of the contemporary Calgary home buyer. Thank you. That's my presentation, and I look forward to the questions.
We do have quite a few questions already, so I'll start with them. Jackie asked, how long have you lived in an infill, and why did you choose that type of housing?
Well, as I said, I've lived in this house since 1992. We were living in a townhouse in Calvin Grove off of Glenmore Trail. We didn't like having to pay condo fees, and we didn't like the fact that we're kind of in it. Like there were other townhouses, there was a small apartment block, and it just seemed like you're kind of the lowest common denominator as far as managing things, and it was just more complicated. So we found that the infill house was kind of like a townhouse. We still had a front yard, a backyard, we had our garage, but not a lot of maintenance. And so it suited our lifestyle.
Walt asked, do you think that there should be some design restrictions or requirements for infills in order to better fit with the character of a community?
I don't. I think that, we live in a free world. I mean, it's like, you don't tell people how to dress, what clothes to wear, how to have their hair done. I think, the developers, they do their research, they come up with a design. If they can't sell it, they're the ones that take the loss, or they have to, reduce the price. And as I think I tried to say is that, yes, I think, often the new house and the old house is quite jarring in juxtaposition today. But as those heritage homes get replaced, then a new aesthetic gets developed. Now, again, that's why I would prefer, rather than isolated heritage homes, to look for blocks or half blocks where you could keep the integrity of 4 or 5 houses, and then they have their own aesthetics and so on. But no, I'm not a big fan of that. Just to me creates cookie cutter homes, and everything looks the same, and that to me is boring. And what's interesting is that many of the new communities that are being built today are being built in the same density and with the same kinds of aesthetics, the townhomes, the front porches of the older communities. And so it's kind of interesting that 100 years later, we're actually going back to a similar urban aesthetics in our new suburbs. It's only the ones that were built in the 60s, 70s, 80s that were kind of the bigger home, the front garage, and so on. I mean, you go into the new communities now, and 50% of those homes are multifamily, small apartment condo complexes.
We have a question from Lori. Comments on quality and durability of construction at various times. For example, immediate post-World War II, and on what becomes of construction materials following deconstruction.
That is an issue. I realize that's an issue that, a lot of this ends up in a landfill. And I think, the city could do a better job probably of demanding and requiring recycling of materials. I think that happens in some cases with larger projects where they want to, get some sort of a green seal of approval. And part of the getting that is recycling of materials. A little harder with a single family home. Small builders. I mean, that's one of the issues that you have a lot of times with, infill homes, is that smaller builders who don't have, maybe the ability or the financing to be able to do some of those things. But as those things become more important, I'm sure that the customer will demand that what happened to the materials. I'm sure that there is a movement afoot to make sure that we recycle things. And I think some of the councillors are all over that.
Jocelyn said that I don't think you mentioned Altador. Isn't it a heritage home area?
Yes, there are heritage homes in Altador. Probably I didn't just include all 26 communities, but yes, there are. And actually I did, because I did the street on the backside. I think it's 34th Street or 34th Avenue, where all they were converted into shops, right? I mean, there was all those brightly painted. So there is an example. I mean, there are others for sure. And Altador is a very interesting place, and it has certainly been invaded by infill, especially along the main street, and is changing the character of that community. But I think, for the best, and I know right now because of construction and so on, it's a mess. But I think we have to realize that, it's much more complicated when you're tearing things out and you're doing it, you're not doing it comprehensively like you're doing in the suburbs. You do one project now, and then you do another project, 5 years from now, and another project. It's a bit like trying to put a jigsaw puzzle together, and, all the pieces go together eventually, but not right away.
Walt asked, infill houses may be attractive to young families, but many of the condos, apartments are not particularly attractive to families with young children. This kind of diversity would be positive, but doesn't seem to happen often enough. Solutions, maybe, for that?
Well, I'm not sure if the question, I have a big issue with some of these townhouses. I mean, these stacked, or not stacked, the condo or the corner conversions, because they have these townhouses that are very narrow and mostly stairs. And I don't see that as being very attractive to me as a senior as I get older. And I don't see it very attractive. I would love to see a stacked townhouse where there would be one level on the first level, one second, one third, and a basement with an elevator. But interestingly enough, I mean, right across the street from me, across the park, was a corner conversion of townhouses. All three were sold to families, young families with young kids. So, as much as we maybe don't think that they appeal to young families, they do. And the stairs don't seem to be that big of an issue. I mean, one of the advantages of these kinds of homes is that, you know, instead of a single family home being, you know, because again, I mean, the lots are often $600,000. You know, building a house is $600,000 or 700, you know, depending on the men, you know, and so you now, you know, I mean, one of the biggest issues that I think for infills is that they're not affordable for the average Calgarian. And that's why they still have to live in the suburbs. I think I've written about this, that, you know, if you look at the average annual income of a Calgary household, 80% have to live in the suburbs. That's where they can find affordable housing at 30% of their, you know, their household income, unless they're prepared to make certain sacrifices, or, you know, and we all do. Like you said, you make certain, you know, you choose to some extent where you live. But I think that, you know, the developers in the city are trying very hard to find ways to make it more affordable for more people to live in the inner city and repopulate the schools and, you know, utilize, you know, existing infrastructure, whether it's fire and ambulance, close to the hospitals. You know, I mean, all of those kinds of things, if we can, you know, get more people and make it affordable for them. But unfortunately, you know, as the demand is higher, then the price goes up. And, you know, we can't seem to build them fast enough. So, you know, it's a supply and demand issue.
Jackie asked, the windshield survey was completed. Volunteers who walked the neighborhoods under the auspices of heritage neighborhoods. They looked at homes built prior to 1945. The homes were assessed as to how many of their original characteristics remained. So that was a comment.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting. And when they did it, because I think they may have missed one on our street, because I asked because there was nothing. And kind of what's ironic for me is that many people come to our house and think it was built in 1910, because it is white, but it's vinyl siding. It's not wood, but it has a nice front porch and it has, you know, big trees still. You know, we didn't tear down any of the trees, and so it's quite a compliment, I think. And so, you know, to one of the other participants, I mean, you can build infills that look exactly like, say, that street in Sun Alta with porches up and down, peaked roofs. I mean, one of the issues, I know some people hate the flat roofs, but the reason for the flat roofs is the city puts a height restriction on these buildings. And so people want 9-foot ceilings. So, or 10-foot ceilings. So now, instead of putting the peak and putting an attic, they put a flat or a slightly sloped roof so that they can get the extra space that makes it feel less skinny, makes it feel more like a home. And so it's all these things that have unintended consequences, that the design is driven by some of the other design guidelines. And that's where I think sometimes we get caught. We try to fix one problem and we cause two others.
Thank you. And there's another comment about that by Isabel. The windshield survey showed is part of an initiative by the city to conserve the character of inner city communities and heritage guidelines, areas where new construction would complement the older homes. The city is exploring ideas like lane houses to increase the density without destroying the older homes. And Isabel also said a well-designed infill can complement the character of a heritage street, not destroy it. They don't have to copy or mimic the past, but they should reflect and respect the past in the older communities.
Yeah, but I would argue that that's very subjective. You know, I mean, how do you, you know, you say complement, but when one person says that this complements, another person says it doesn't. I mean, that's a very subjective, and that's where you get into these discussions, I think, that become very hard, because who makes that decision that it's complementary? I don't want to make that decision. I don't think it's fair. And I think, you know, to me, we are creating a new aesthetic. You know, it's just like we don't wear the same clothes that we wore in 1945. Why don't we wear the same, you know, do our clothes have to be complementary to what people wore in 1945? There's new materials, you know, I just don't think that makes a lot of sense, but that's my opinion.
Thank you. Yvonne said, we built an infill in Killarney on part of a lot where the original farmhouse was beautifully renovated for a young family. A good way to preserve the original home at the same time as increasing the density on the lot.
Yeah, and I think that's perfectly fine. I mean, there was a small house on the lot, use my personal experience. There was a small house. It wasn't a small cottage house. It was probably built in the 40s. It had 2 stories. It did have a bedroom upstairs in the attic. I don't know whether that was initially. And when our developer developed, he subdivided the 100-foot lot into 3 lots, 30, 30, 40. And built 2 houses, kept the old house, sold it. And many, families moved through that house until eventually the family that's in it now. And then they decided that they would tear it down and build a monster house, or not a lovely house, but it's, it suits their needs. And so, I think that every infill site is a different site and has different opportunities, different criteria. And it really depends on who you're building it for. I mean, yes, you will find people who will live in 1,000 or 1,200 square foot or 750 square foot. And I think that's great. And I think, that's something we need to accommodate. But there's most people, and we've seen that the average house in North America, in Canada, for the 1950s was about 800 square feet. And now it's about 2,000 square feet. And, that's reality. And I think at some point you have to face reality. That's what makes city attractive place to live, is having nice homes that meet current, the current demands, the current expectations of young families, of seniors, and a diversity. So, we've got, not very far from us, a 4-story condo that fits very nicely. It's right one or 2 lots from Crowchild Trail, but it works, it fits in. There's seniors housing on that street, there's duplexes on that street. I think, again, the diversity of design, the diversity of scale, to me, it's much more about diversity than it is density. The density will happen with diversity. But density doesn't necessarily cause diversity if in fact you don't get different sizes of projects. And like I say, every infill, every site should be different.
Jocelyn asked, what trends are you seeing with the lane houses?
Well, I mean, I think it's a very exciting. I don't know if there's a trend. I mean, there's more of them. I think the city has gotten, it's like a lot of things. The more the city sees them happen, the more the architects and developers see how they work, the more they're able to accommodate them. Again, I think they have a limited attractiveness, because they used to call them mother-in-law suites, but if it's above the garage, you either have to put an elevator in or mom's got to climb a huge amount of stairs to get in. They do make, and I know there's one in ours where, they would make good studio space, whether it's for a nail studio or a small business. And I think, COVID's going to change everything. I think with COVID, and you're seeing these, even these manufactured small homes that they can plop into a backyard. I can see garages being converted into office space. I can see, depending on how the world evolves, I mean, we may start to look and say that garage is more valuable as a workspace than it is to store 2 cars. And I'd love to see, a better car sharing program where the car sharing would be on your street. You've got 10 homes on your street, you've got 20, 30 cars. They're half of them are probably sitting in the garage half the time. And I think with technology, we could change all that.
Thank you. And I personally would like to ask you, I've been living here for only 16 years, and I could be wrong, but I think that what I found when I moved here is very different than what it is now in the mentality of the inner city and infills, and what younger families actually choosing now. Is it really kind of dramatically changed in the last 15 to 20 years, do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's an evolution. I think it's very slow. I think you're right. I think, again, we're much more conscious of climate change now, which means, smaller homes, more walkable communities. I think you're seeing people, wanting to live in a walkable community. I think an interesting stat that I saw in a survey that was done a few years ago is that 45% of Calgarians think they live in a walkable community. So even though, a lot of the planners and people will say it's not walkable, and it really depends. I mean, a lot of times they give a lot of importance to a school, but if you don't have any children, school's not that important. I think some places, they give a lot of importance to a grocery store. But in North America, where, you have a larger home with a big fridge and a freezer, access to a grocery store is not the same as it is in Europe when you're shopping every day.
Yeah.
And so, those numbers need to be changed and reflected. Here, access to a bike path is important, but maybe more recreationally than it is for transportation.
But
So-
I think I've seen lots of changes there, like
Well, that's
positive
right. I mean, that was what I was
changes
going to say. So, but there's a big change is that,
Yeah.
People are using the bikes as transportation. Again, climate change, again, people being much more conscious. Again, smaller families continue. So now you've got one child, you can do things differently if you've got two adults and one child than when you used to have two adults and six kids.
Mhm.
The world is evolving slowly, and Calgary is evolving for sure. And so, yeah, no, I don't know that it's a revolutionary change. I think it's a gradual change. Some people may see it more than others, but like I say, I've lived 25 years in my community, and in some ways nothing's changed. In some ways, my street is
Mhm.
exactly the same, and yet there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 infills on my block. 7 infills on my block, and yet I would say nothing's changed. It still feels the same because one happens every 5 years, and then it gets integrated into the landscape, and then the next one comes. And so, yeah, and I mean, I think that's, there are some streets where they just plow it all down, but in the most cases, it's one at a time, and in fact, you can look at the infills and you can tell what year they were built, by the materials. They were,
Mhm.
they were vinyl siding, and then they were brick, and then, they were, cubist and square and flat roofed, and you can actually, it's kind of like and they're all these little twins, right? Because they build two houses that are the same or a twin, and then they build another two houses, and it's the 10 years later, so it's a different aesthetic. It would be a fascinating study for an MBA at architect student.
I know, I just like the change that I see. That's what I wanted to say. I think it's a positive change.
Yeah,
I mean, as much as I love those older houses, and on one hand, I really would like if we can preserve as many as we can. On the other hand, that those infills, and especially younger families with children wanting more and more to live in those infills that may be much smaller than what they could have afforded in a suburb, but they still choose inner city. I think that is kind of changing the whole climate in the city in a positive way.
And not
That's my
everybody,
personal.
yeah, not everybody needs, I mean, majority of the jobs now are not downtown. The majority of jobs are on the edge of the city. The majority, like the airport is a huge, and all of that distribution center in the southeast. So it makes sense for people to live there, and they can commute there easily than living in the city center. I mean, we need to think about, how many people need to live in the city center to make it a complete community with a downtown that might have used to have 160,000 workers. Now maybe it has 140,000. Well, and is that going to increase like it did before? So I do think that, people sort of, it's the suburbs versus the inner city, and it shouldn't be. We need both of them. They both need.
We do, yeah, of course.
And so I do think that, and I think the infills, it shouldn't be infills versus heritage. I mean, I don't even know that we should preserve as many as possible of the heritage homes. To me, what we need to do is identify the key sites, the key heritage homes, and make sure that there is a critical mass of heritage homes that people can still appreciate. But it doesn't mean that we need to sort of, because Toronto's preserve 50% of their heritage homes, we need to preserve 50% of ours. Many of our heritage homes might be smaller and therefore not as conducive. If you have big homes, if you had the big boarding house homes that they used to have, say in downtown Toronto or Vancouver, like in Mole Hill, they convert themselves very nicely to modern uses. A little tiny cottage working house doesn't really convert itself very easily. Now, again, you could keep the house and then build on the back. So that's another option that I saw a little bit in Nashville, where instead of building side by side, they build front and back. So now you use the back of the lot, build your big house there, and then you have this little house that becomes your lobby or your porch or your sunroom. And that's, and I don't see that happening very much in Calgary, but that would be another way of potentially preserving the streetscape and pushing the big house to the back to the alley.
Well, thank you so much. I truly
Thank
enjoyed
you.
your talk, Richard. And I would like to ask Kathleen now to do the closing remarks.
Well, thank you, Richard. And do check out our website at chinookhistory.ca for information both regarding the virtual and in-person programs we have this week. And on that, we also find a list of the supporters and how to join our society and how to support our programs.